Welcome everyone to another week of Ramban ala Parsha. This week we have the great zchut of beginning not just a new Parsha as we do every week, but a new Sefer Vayikra. And there is an excitement and there's a newness to beginning a new Sefer because as the Ramban points out many times, there's a theme to every Sefer. You know, the Sefer HaBriyah of Sefer Breshit and how that plays through the role modeling of the Avot and Maaseh Avot Siman Labanim, the theme of Geula, of Galut and Geula in Sefer Shmot, and that sets us up for Sefer Vayikra, which is basically, you know, to Kohanim, it's the Karbanot, and more than that, it's limitations, places we can and cannot go in the Beit HaMikdash, things we can eat, things we can't eat, and even there, you know, it's connected thematically to the Karbanot, but the Torah never uses the phrase, the Torah doesn't have a word like treif or kosher. The Torah has tameh and tahar. They're synonyms for those words. But says the Ramban, you know, essentially, well, if you ate it, A, you wouldn't be able to go into the Beit HaMikdash because you'd be tameh, and B, you'd have to bring a karban. So that's what they're all doing here, including all the way through Emor, which the Ramban talks about the importance of the karbanot that are brought on the Chagim. The Ramban only struggles with, and we did this last year, so I'm not doing it again now, but the Ramban only struggles with Kiddushim, which, when you look there, you know, is Daber al Kol Adat B'nei Yisrael Lemor Kiddushim Tiyu Ki Kadosh Ani Hashem Elokechem, right? All the rest of Vayikra is more or less starts with the Emor La Kohanim B'nei Aaron. It's always B'nei Aaron, it's always the Kohanim. Kiddushim is not. We'll have to deal with that when we come there. That's one problem. Bahar B'chu Kota is another problem. Again, the Ramban wants a theme that runs through the entirety of the Sefer. When we get there, we'll have to talk about why that is. But why don't we start at the very beginning? In the very beginning, it's strange. The pasuk says, "Vayikra Moshe, Vayidaber Hashem elav me'ol moed lemor." And the Ramban wants to know on some level, what's Vayikra Moshe? Moshe needs an invitation. Why does the Torah report that? So says the first Ramban in Vayikra, Amar HaKatuv B'kan, Vayikra Moshe Vayidaber Hashem elav v'lo kein b'shar mekamo. Don't keep looking to Vayikra Moshe. It's not going to come up again. Ba'avur shelo hayam Moshe yachol lavo el ol moed lihiyoto nigash el hamakom asher sham ha'elokim rak b'kriya sheyikroto. Says the Ramban, Moshe Rabbeinu didn't enter and didn't feel comfortable entering the Kodesh HaKadoshim until HaKadosh Baruch Hu invited him. Vayikra means to call, but also it's sort of like an invitation. Shekvar ne'emar leMoshe v'dibarti itcha me'al hakaporet asher ivoed lecha shama. Moshe Rabbeinu knew that one of the major purposes, or maybe the major purpose for the Ramban of the Mishkan, is a place where God can speak to Moshe. V'kevan sheyada she'Hashem yoshev akruvim sham nityarei lavo. Interesting. The Ramban thinks Moshe Rabbeinu knew that he was supposed to go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, but he was afraid. Nityarei lavo ba'oel klal ad sheyikra elav. Moshe felt like the appropriate thing was for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to call him, and only then to enter. Ka'asher bahar Sinai she'amar vayikra Moshe bayom hashvi'i mitoch ha'anan. Moshe waited 6 full days on Har Sinai till HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose to call him. And certainly if you like the Ramban and you see the Mishkan as a miniature Maimad Har Sinai, well, the same thing should take place, and the same thing did. Moshe Rabbeinu waited, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu called him. That's one possibility, says Ramban. Second possibility, O shelo hayam Moshe yodea shehakavod ba'ohel v'shihiyeh lo hadibur misham. Or says Ramban, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Moshe Rabbeinu didn't know the plan, didn't know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was kiviyachol waiting for him. Ki lo kiso ha'anan ad yom hashmini kidat rabotenu. Right? The cloud didn't cover the Mishkan until the Chanukas HaMishkan, which was Vayhi Bayom Hashmini. Va'acharei HaKriya ba Moshe ba'oel lifnai v'lifnim. And only after God called him, then Moshe came inside. Ki Moshe doshu Aaron beval yavo, ve'ein Moshe beval yavo. Fascinating, right? The Torah tells us in Achreinos that Aaron HaKohen, the Kohen Gadol, can only come into the Mishkan, say the simple pshat, on Yom HaKippurim, and Bizot Yavo Aaron el HaOel, Bepar ben Moray, with the Karbanot of that day. So says the Ramban, quoting the Medrash, that applied to Aaron. It didn't apply to Moshe. Moshe could come whenever he wanted. V'zed derech pshat ba'katuv. Ukva perashtiv lamala. And that's the pshat in the pasuk. V'rabotenu amru ki l'chol hadibrot l'chol ha'amirot l'chol hatzivuyim kadma kriya. It's a lashon chiba. Before HaKadosh Baruch Hu spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu, he called out. Yes, it only says it here, Vayikra Moshe, but essentially Chazal say you should imagine that every other place where HaKadosh Baruch Hu starts speaking to Moshe Rabbeinu, first he invites him, first he calls him. Klomar, Sheyomar love Moshe, Moshe vayomer hineni, v'zeh derech chiba v'zeruz Moshe. It's a sign of love, it's a sign of companionship, it's to get Moshe excited. V'hinei al da'atam hizkir zeh bekan ba'avu shehu tchilat hadibur asher haya elav me'ol moed l'lamed al kulam. The Torah told it to us here because this is the first time that HaKadosh Baruch Hu met Moshe at Ohel Moed, and he wants to let you know that every time God spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu, beforehand he called out to him, he invited him. Ki kein yihiyeh mishpato kol hayamim b'chol haTorah. That's how they related to each other going forward. Ume'ol Moed l'da'atam hu mukdam. Okay, fine. The rest of the Ramban is less to our point. The point the Ramban doesn't make, although maybe he hints at, is the flaw of the Parshiyot, right? The way the Ramban explains it, the end of Sefer Shmot, beautiful. Ki anan Hashem al mishkan yomam ve'esh ti'alai labo le'nei kol beit Yisrael b'chol ma'asehem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Shechina appears on the Mishkan. Naturally, the next pasuk is Vayikra Moshe vayidara Hashem elav me'ol moed le'mor. So naturally, HaKadosh Baruch Hu called out from the Mishkan to Moshe Rabbeinu to tell him, let's talk. To tell him, and now I'm going to give you the rest of the Torah, and you'll give it to Klal Yisrael. That was the purpose. All of Sefer Shmot was to build a Mishkan. Once the Mishkan is built, the first thing that happens is God calls Moshe because he has to tell him the Torah. Okay, that's the very opening of the Sefer. Now, very quickly, because I think we touched on it last year, the purpose of Karbanot. This is a pretty well-known machlokes between the Rambam and the Ramban, and we're going to see two Rambans that relate to each other. Says the Ramban in Perek Aleph, Pasuk Tet, on the word Olah. I'll just read you the Pasuk. The Pasuk says, Olah ishe reach nichach l'Hashem. So in the middle of that Ramban, he says, Va'amar harav b'moreh hanevuchim. The Ramban not often, but often quotes the Moreh Nevuchim almost always to disagree with him. So the Rambam in the Moreh says, Kitama karbanot ba'avur shehamitzrim v'hakastim asher hayu Yisrael gerim v'toshavim ba'artzam me'olam hayu ovdim libakar ulitzon. Says the Rambam pretty commonly in the Moreh, the purpose of the mitzvah as well, the Goyim worshipped bakar and son. Ki hamitzrim ovdim litleh, they worshipped the sheep. V'hakastim ovdim l'shedim asher yiru lahem bidmut seirim. And the Kastim worshipped ghosts that looked like goats. V'anshe hodu ad hayom, and Indians until this day lo yishchatu bakar l'olam, right? They never would sacrifice a cow. Ba'avur kain tziva lishchot eila hashlosha minim lashem hanichbad. Therefore, specifically, lahotzi milibam shel ovdei avodah zarah, God commanded us to sacrifice these three types of animals because they were worshipped by ovdei avodah zarah. Kidei sheyoda ki hadavar shayu choshvim ki heim betachlit ha'avera hu asher yakrivu laborei. The things that they're most terrified to kill, sheep and goats and cows, no, that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants. It's to tell you that the ovdei avodah zarah are wrong. Ubo yitchapru ha'avonot. Not only are they wrong, but this is how we get kapara, right? The purpose of karbanot is to get us kapara. We do that through sacrificing sheep and goats and cows. If we want to make the point that the ovdei avodah zarah are wrong, says the Rambam, we have to do the opposite of them. That's how you take something out of your heart. That's how you stop believing in something. That's why we do karbanot. Eile dvarav ubahem ha'erich. Says the Ramban. This is what the Rambam says, and he spends a long time explaining it, and it's a theme in the Moreh. And the Ramban was not a big fan of the Moreh Nevuchim, by the way. V'hinei, says the Ramban, heim divrei havai. It's silly. Yirapu shever gadol v'kushya rabba al nikle yasu shulchan Hashem megoal, and makes the mizbeach something horrible. She'einenu rak lahotzi miliban shel rishayim v'tipshei olam v'akatuv amar ki hem lechem isher reach nichoach l'Hashem. Says the Ramban, I don't like the Rambam's thing at all. The Rambam's point is, it's just to prove the Ovdei Avodah Zarah wrong, as if there's no value in the whole process of bringing a carbon. And the Ramban wants there to be a value, and he thinks the pasuk says so. Ishei reach nichoach l'Hashem. There's something positive in carbonot. So now I'm skipping a little bit in the Ramban, and then he says, it's a strong proof, says the Ramban. And also, I think our hearts are with the Ramban on this. We want there to be something more than just disproving Avodah Zarah. So says the Ramban, V'hinei Noach b'tseito min hateva im shloshet banav. Ein ba'olam kasti o mitzri. Right? Noach came out of the teva. He was the only person in the world. He, his 3 sons and their wives. And he brought a carbon. Right? Vayitav b'nei Hashem. Who was he disproving? Says the Ramban. He wasn't disproving anybody. He says when Cain and Hevel brought carbonot, there was no Avodah Zarah in the world. There was just their father, Adam Harishon, who met God, who knew God. He wasn't an Oved Avodah Zarah, chas v'shalom. So this is what's the Rambam talking about. I'm skipping a little bit. V'chalila shelo yehi bahem shum to'elet v'ratzon. It can't be that something so foundational to our religion has no internal reason. Rak sholalut la'avodas gilulim midat hashotim. Okay, it doesn't make any sense. So instead, what is it? So says the Ramban. Ki ba'avur shema'asei b'nei adam nigmarim b'machshava u'b'dibur u'b'ma'aseh. He says anything that we do, that we humans do, involves thought, involves speech, and involves action. The Ramban's going to expand the definition of a carbon from the actual sacrifice of a carbon to the process of bringing a carbon. Therefore, Tziva Hashem ki ka'asher yechta v'yavi carbon yismoch yadav alav kineged ha'ma'aseh. First of all, you have to do an action. The action is resting your hands on the carbon. Next, v'yisvadeh befiv kineged hadibor. Then you have to say something. The thing that you say is, I'm sorry for doing X, Y, and Z. That's vidui. 3, v'yisrof ba'esh haker v'haklayot shem klei ha'machshava v'hatava. And then in every carbon you burn at least the innards, which in the old days, the kerev and the klayot, were thought of as the seat of desire. Okay? V'akrayim kineged yalav raglav shel adam ha'osim kol melacha. V'yizrok hadam al hamizbeach kineged damon b'nafsho kidei sheyachshov adam ba'asoto kol eile. What do you think? Ki chata leilokav b'gufo u'b'nafsho. When a person brings a carbon, says the Ramban, he's going to think to himself, I sinned. I sinned in all 3 ways. I sinned with my body, I sinned with my thought, I sinned with my speech. V'ra'ui lo sheyishafech damo v'yisrof gufo. Really, because I sinned, God should kill me. And my blood should be spilled and it should be sprinkled. Lulei chesed haborei shalakach mimenu timura v'kofer hakarban hazeh shei damo tachat damo. Says the Ramban, when you go to the Beis HaMikdash and bring a carbon, you're supposed to imagine that you're the carbon. You're supposed to imagine that what's happening to the carbon should have happened to you. Nefesh tachas nefesh, v'rashei evrei hakarban kineged rashei evarav, v'hamanot la'achayot b'hem morei Torah shitpalu alav, etc. So the Ramban rejects the Rambam. The Rambam says carbonot are just to disprove Ovdei Avodah Zarah. Says the Ramban, no, God forbid. We brought carbonot when there were no Ovdei Avodah Zarah in the world. There's a value in carbon unrelated to Avodah Zarah, and the value is imagining that the carbon is coming in my place. Imagining that every Aveira that I do, in theory, should be a Chiyuv Misa. It should be my blood on the Mizbeach. It should be me on the Mizbeach. It should be me who's sacrificing himself. And the Ramban says, that's the Reach Nichach of the Mizbeach. When a person has proper kavanah, when he says vidui, when a person has proper kavanah, when he burns the carbon, when a person has... It's supposed to remind us that, in the famous English phrase, there but for the grace of God, go I. It really should be me. It's not me. Thank God, God is accepting this carbon in my place. But I really should imagine that it's me. I should imagine that I have a chi of misa and that God is accepting this. Okay? So just to remind you, the Ramban rejects this idea of the Rambam that carbonot are just for the purpose of disproving of the avodah zarah. Now, the Ramban rejects that as a general explanation for carbonot, but as we'll see in a second, he doesn't reject it in the specific. What do I mean by that? Well, you go to Parak Bet, Pasuk Yud Gimel. Okay? There's a very, very strange halacha there. The Torah in the middle of all the menachot, and you ask yourself, what are the menachot made of? They're made out of flour, right? They must be chametz. Kol hamincha asher takrivu l'Adonai lo te'aseh chametz ki chol sa'or v'chol dvash lo saktir mimenu isha l'Adonai. Right? It's not just something in the parsha. Obviously, we're 2 weeks before Pesach, or less than 2 weeks before Pesach, right? The Isser Chametz isn't just an Isser 7 days a year on Pesach. It's an Isser 365 days a year on the Mizbeach. Why would that be? Says the Ramban, Kol ha-mincha she'takrivu l'Hashem lo te'aseh chametz, asar lahavi ha-mincha chametz. There's a blanket prohibition on bringing a mincha. And again, a mincha, it's not, obviously there's a blanket prohibition on bringing chametz with a carbon, an ola, a shlamim, a chatas. They have no bread. But a mincha is all bread. It's all flour. Yeah, there are ones that you soak in oil and the ones that you fry in less oil. There's different things and you crumble them up. But they should have been chametz. Says Ramban, no, says the Torah, no, you can't bring chametz. Asar lahavi mincha chametz. Va'achar kach amar lo taktir mimenu le'esor shelo yachmitz hakometz v'yaktirenu. You need to be careful that the kmitza that you do from the dough is not left to rise and become chametz. V'ikanes bichlal lo taktir mimenu isha. Okay, it would be asur. Okay, now, why? And it also, while I'm asking why about karbanot, you can also ask why about chametz on Pesach. And there's much to discuss, and there's a lot of parallels. Says the Ramban, V'tam has-sa'or v'hadvash. Right, it's not just that you can't bring chametz on the Mizbeach, you can't bring dvash on the Mizbeach, you can't bring honey. Yitachein, shehu kedivrei harav b'mor nevuchim. It's so fascinating. All of a sudden, the Ramban is a fan of the Mor Nevuchim. What's the idea in the Mor Nevuchim? Amar, shematza b'sifreihem shehaminhag haya ba'ov de avodah zara lahakriv kol minchatam chametz ula'arev hadvash b'chol karbanehem. Says the Rambam, I found out that Ov de avodah zara used to bring chametz for their karbanot, and they'd mix honey in it. And therefore, v'lachein asram legavoa. So the Torah assered that kind of approach to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'kazeh amu rabotenu b'matzeva shayta nivchert b'mei ha'avot v'achar kach san'a Hashem mipnei shasu chok la'avodas gilulim. Right? God is allowed to change his mind with respect to things that are now seen as classic avodah zarah. So the Ramban rejects the idea that all karbanot are in opposition to avodah zarah, but he accepts the Rambam's idea that the prohibition on chametz and dvash on the mizbeach is a result of avodah zarah and is to reject avodah zarah. So you could say, and it makes complete sense, the Ramban doesn't want to turn a major institution in Judaism into something that's just lahotzi milibam shel ovdei avodah zarah. He wouldn't want to do that. But the details within the Parsha of Karbanot, the details within Sefer Vayikra, there the Ramban is willing to accept the Rambam's idea that chametz represents avodah zarah. And just as an aside, we think, Rav Kasher has a piece on this also, where he thinks that, many people discuss, how come chametz is also b'mashahu? And how come on top of that, it's not just also b'mashahu, but it's also b'bal yiro, b'bal yimatzeh. Why all the chumras with respect to chametz? I think the normal, the simple, regular answer that we give is, well, since chametz is mutter all year long, except for Pesach, So we need to be worried, because in the ordinary course, if you're walking down the street and you're in Yerushalayim and you see a Danish, so you'll go into the bakery and you'll buy it, because you eat Danishes your whole life. They're kosher. Here, that's not the case. So not only is there an Isser Achila and an Isser Hana, but it's b'mashahu, not b'kizayis, and there's also an Isser of Bal Yiro, Bal Yimatzeh. You can't see it, you can't own it. But Rav Kasher suggests, and there's a lot of support for this, that the core Isser of Chametz relates to Avodah Zarah. And that is a process that left unattended, right, becomes something bad. To be frum, to be careful, to be Ovdei Hashem, you have to be careful. You have to stop things, right? The definition of matzah, interestingly, is something that could have become chametz, but I stopped the process, right? It's aborted chametz. If it could never have become chametz, it can't be matzah, right? The idea that kitnios could be matzah is wrong. Kitnios aren't chametz. There's a gzeira, because rice can't rise. Rice can't become. But the chameshes minei dagan can rise. In the ordinary course, if you leave them alone, they will rise, they will ferment, and they'll become chametz. And there's something in there about Avodah Zarah, right? If you leave it alone, if you ignore it, if you don't attend to yourself, you don't ask yourself, how am I doing as an Oved Hashem? God forbid you can come to Avodah Zarah. God forbid you can come to do bad things. That's a general approach of the Ramban, and that's a general approach to chametz. Okay, last point for today, before it gets too late. If you go to Perek Daled, Pasuk Bet, you'll find the following. Nefesh ki techeta, daber b'nei Yisrael lemor, nefesh ki techeta bishgaga mikol mitzvot Adonai asher lo te'asena va'asa me'ach. What does it mean, nefesh ki techeta bishgaga? What does it mean to do something b'shogeg? If I did it by accident, it's not really my fault. Why am I bringing a carbon? And as we all know, most carbonot, a chata certainly is brought overwhelmingly for a sin that b'mezid would have been a chiyuv kares, and so b'shogeg is a chatas. But what responsibility do I have for a shogeg? So says the Ramban, ba'avur heyot hamachshava b'nefesh, right? The idea of doing something wrong comes from your nefesh. V'hi hashogeget, and so it's the nefesh that sins. Now again, it's a little hard to know when the Ramban says nefesh. Does he mean your brain? Does he mean your heart? His kir kan nefesh. V'tama karbonot al hanefesh hashogeget mipnei shekol ha'avonot yolidu ginai b'nefesh v'hei mumba. Right? He says, any sin that you do, even if you're not responsible, it sounds like, it yields some kind of negativity in your nefesh. V'lo tizker lahakpil pnei yotzro rak bihiyota tahora mikol chet. If you want to meet HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if you want to feel close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, something we all want, you need to be clean of sin. If that weren't the case, then every idiot would be close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's not what we see in the world, and that's not how it works. So a simple reading of the Ramban basically says a shogeg is not your fault. But it leaves a residue. It leaves some kind of negative buildup, and that negative buildup has to be erased by a carbon chatas. But I don't know, certainly the Ramban elsewhere sounds otherwise, and I think even here, you have to ask yourself, what is a shogeg? So let's compare a shogeg to an ones, or what we would call in halacha misasek. So if I go into the bathroom at 3 a.m. on a Friday night, and on my way out I shut off the light, that's a classic shogeg. What does it mean? It means I did something wrong, but I didn't do it on purpose. But it needs kapara. Why? Because I did something wrong. If I was a better person, if I was more God aware, when I came out of the bathroom, I would have remembered that it was Shabbos. Yes, there's an excuse. It's like an excused absence for school. You missed school, but it's excused, but you still missed school. On the other hand, there's what's called an ones slash misasek. This I actually observed in my own life. When I was a kid, I davened in a shtibel, right? Let's say there's one piece of kugel left. So obviously, everybody wants the last piece of kugel, and you're reaching for the kugel, and a guy knocks your hand away because he wants to take the kugel, and your hand hits the light switch and shuts off the light. Do you have to do tshuva for that? No. If you were the frommest person in the world, you couldn't have prevented that. It wasn't that you were unaware of the fact that it was usur. Some guy, you didn't even do an action. So that doesn't require tshuva. But shogeg requires tshuva. And shogeg isn't just one example, right? There's shogeg karov lemezid, and there's shogeg karov lonis. They're all different types of shogegim. But broadly speaking, says the Ramban, if you're a shogeg, it's not your fault, but you need kapara. And that's what a chatas is, right? It wasn't my fault. I really didn't remember that it was Shabbos. But I should have. And I should feel terrible about it. And I have what to apologize to God for and what to ask for forgiveness for. It's not just the residue. If I was more frum, if I was more God aware, I wouldn't have made this mistake. So right, it's not the worst thing ever. It's not, God forbid, that I did something terrible. That's a chi of chat, that's a chi of kares, or a chi of misa, God forbid. But there is still something that I have to apologize for. There is still something I have to ask God for forgiveness for. To be the perfect person, to be the better person who I want to be, I have to bring a chatas. Okay, so we saw 4 different Rambans today. First, Vayikra Moshe. Moshe wanted and needed an invitation, and the idea that we're supposed to read that into every single other place where God speaks to Moshe, that God loved Moshe and therefore reached out to him with an invitation like he did on Har Sinai. We saw the famous machlokas Ramban and Rambam about the reason for karbanot. The Ramban rejects the Rambam's idea that it's just a rejection of avodah zarah. Yet the Ramban, with respect to the prohibition of chametz on the mizbeach, agrees with the Rambam that chametz is also mizbeach because that's how Ovdei avodah zarah did it. Okay, that's interesting. In front of the last Ramban about shogeg, where I think the Ramban really holds that shogeg needs kapara, because if we were better, we wouldn't have made the mistake that we made. That's it for today. Yashkach to everybody. I don't believe we'll have a shir on Tzav, because it's literally Erev Pesach. We'll see. Yashkach to everybody. Shabbat Shalom. And if I don't speak to you before then, Chag Kasher V'Sameach.